It's great to be here, and it's great to have a very special guest here with us today. I visited Singapore for the first time, I think it was maybe 9 years ago, and ever since that time, I always wanted to bring to Croatia somebody from Singapore who could tell us more about the Singapore story. However, for one reason or another, it never really worked until this year. Today we have a really great honor and pleasure to have with us here Mr. George Yeo, or Yeo, or there's like various, many ways of how you can pronounce your surname as you told me. George has a really impressive CV and background, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about him. George is currently chairman of Hong Kong-based Kerry Logistics. It's a leading logistics company in Asia. George studied his undergrad degree in engineering at Cambridge in UK. He did MBA at Harvard Business School. He spent, 12 years in the Singaporean military?
16 years.
16 years in the Singaporean military, obtaining the rank of general. And after that, he switched to Singaporean government, first as a minister of Arts and Information, after that as Minister of Trade and Industry. He was also Minister of Healthcare in Singapore, and I think the last post that he held was Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, usually in a lifetime, if you just reach one of those things, you can consider yourself to be successful. Consider to be successful. I'm a general in the army. So it's great to have him here today with us. We're kind of lucky, actually, the way this worked out, because George was he had this slot of couple of days in between going to US for his son's graduation ceremony and going to Vatican on Monday, where he's a member of, he was appointed by the Holy Father, Pope Francis, to be a member of the Vatican Economic Council that oversees the business of the Catholic Church. So, George, it's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And let's start. The way I want to do this is we're going to have a discussion for maybe half an hour, and then I'm going to open the panel to the questions. So start thinking about your questions. You're going to have a chance to ask. So last year, Singapore had a 50-year anniversary of its independence. 51 years ago, Singapore was kicked out of the federation with Malaysia. Singapore is an island city-state, roughly the size of Zagreb, somewhere around 700 square kilometers, has zero natural resources, not even water. I think fresh water is also a problem. So after it was kicked out of this federation with Malaysia, many people, the conventional wisdom was such that Singapore will not survive. At the time, the GDP per capita was around 500. Okay, nowadays it's more than 50,000 GDP per capita. It's one of the richest countries in the world. It is a country with one of the best education system, healthcare system. I guess, George, how did you do that? I mean, how did Singapore do it? What was so special about it?
Well, the history of modern Singapore goes back almost 200 years. When the British East India Company established Singapore as a trading post for the China trade. The British went to India. They set up a string of trading posts: Penang, Singapore, 1819, Hong Kong, through the Opium War, 1842, Shanghai. And Singapore is not intelligible by itself. Singapore is only has meaning in relation to the network which created it. That network is now coming back on a much greater scale. The new China trade of the 21st century. So all the links which created Singapore are being re-energized by the re-emergence of China on the global stage. And further down, the re-emergence of India. That Singapore should be a city-state, independent and sovereign, that is partly a historical accident. There are many city-states in history, we've always looked up to Venice as an example, as an inspiration. Yesterday, Mato brought me to Dubrovnik, and I think Dubrovnik is also an inspiration to us, how despite being small, but always being of service to others, and being utterly realistic about the larger conditions within which you operate, you can make a good living for yourself and for your people. As always, the internal factors are more important than the external factors. If internally you are sick, if internally you are divided, then there's no way you can adjust to the world outside. If internally there is solidarity, there's unity, there is a clarity that if we don't act together, we are in danger. If we have that internally, then we can always make adjustments. These adjustments require us to be very sensitive to changes in the environment. The only advantage of being small is that you can react faster. You can only react faster if you sense the environment. And we can only sense the environment if somehow the world around us is reflected inside us. If we are full of prejudices about our neighbors, about the big powers, then the mirror is foggy, the lens is dull. But if we suppress our own ego, as it were, then we will see clearly, then we know these are the trends, these are our strengths, these are our weaknesses, how to position ourselves. This can only work if there is peace, if the larger network is stable. If there's no peace, if there are warring factions, then small states are always in danger, and then our lives will be a misery. I mean, this has been part of the history of Croatia. By almost an accident, you have become independent, which is a stroke of good fortune, and the world is relatively peaceful. And as small countries, we have a responsibility to help keep the peace in the region around us and in the world, operating within that network as a node, how to make it interesting and valuable to others. The node doesn't exist as of right. It is always in competition with other nodes. If we are attractive, we keep our own talent, other talent will come to our shores. If we are not attractive, not only will we fail to attract others, we will lose our own people. Then that node will shrink and shrivel. And that's the challenge that we have today. And in today's network world, being small is in some ways an advantage. I was for many years foreign minister and attended the UN General Assembly 7 times. And without fail, every time in the UN, Singapore would host a reception for small countries, meaning countries with populations of 10 million and below. They make up about 50 or more % of the UN membership. We call ourselves the Forum of Small States, FOSS. And I always begin my address saying, the force is with you.
So how did you, when Singapore went its own way from Malaysia, you mentioned the advantages and disadvantages of the country. What advantages did Singapore have? What did the initial leaders, what did Lee Kuan Yew did that was so special and that catapulted Singapore to this growth trajectory that it experienced in the upcoming decades?
Singapore was the most important military base of the British, east of Suez. When during the Second World War, Singapore was taken by the Japanese, Churchill described it as the greatest disaster that had ever befallen the British Empire. And all over Singapore, you will find relics of the British military presence, air, land, and sea. Why was it important to the British? Because of geography. If you look at the map, Singapore is at the southernmost tip of the Eurasian landmass. And for the maritime trade, all ships have got to turn that corner. In the days of the sailing ship, they turn the corner, they wait for the winds to change direction, then they move in the other direction. So that gives Singapore a geographical advantage, which drew people to its shores. But there are many islands in that region which can serve the same function. That it should be Singapore and some other island is because of policies. When Raffles established Singapore, Stamford Raffles, in 1819, he established protection of property, free trade. It was a free port, sanctity of contract, Anglo-Saxon rules of commerce. And just by having the right conditions, it attracted trade in the region and beyond the region to its shores. We became an emporium. Through Singapore, you can buy cheaper, you can sell dearer. So that fundamental dynamic at the core of Singapore has not changed. Lee Kuan Yew thought initially that the only way to achieve independence for Singapore was to merge with Malaysia because the British were worried. Singapore being 3/4 ethnic Chinese, as an independent entity, could become an agent of communist China, and therefore a strategic risk to British interests, to Western interests, and that it was safer to have Singapore achieve independence through a larger federation in which the Chinese were a minority and where the gun was held by non-Chinese. It did not work because it became oppressive. And after 2 years, Singapore became so uncomfortable in the Malaysian body politic, the Malaysians wanted us out, and Lee Kuan Yew and some of his colleagues were also relieved to get out. And that enabled us to strike our own path into the future. Luckily, despite the war in Indochina, our immediate region was at peace. Indonesia was going through a tumultuous period, but there was a coup, counter-coup in 1965, which led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people, but which created stability. And at that time, Japan was becoming expensive, especially after the Plaza Accord in 1985. But even before that, Japan, US, Europe helped to create a virtuous circle of growth in the 4 young tigers: Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And after the Plaza Accord, when many of these countries became more expensive, the growth then spread to other parts of Southeast Asia and eventually to China. So in a series of ignitions, the whole of Asia is now on a historic growth path, something very dramatic. China last year sold 21 million passenger cars compared to 19 million in the US. And these are still relatively early days. So the China factor is huge. I describe it as another sun entering the solar system. And the new sun will become bigger than the present sun. And the entire gravitational field will change. And every heavenly body will enjoy new orbital freedoms, which can be exciting, which can be full of opportunities, which can also be dangerous. Lee Kuan Yew anticipated some of these changes and positioned Singapore for it. But this is just the beginning of an exciting journey. And it's an exciting journey not just for Singapore, but also for you here in Croatia.
But I think you're being way too modest when you kind of implied that Singapore was just riding the trend of growth in the region. There was something special about Singapore, right? There was something that other countries, such as Malaysia, for instance, didn't have. What was the underlying philosophy of Lee Kuan Yew and the early leaders when they were creating the policies that kind of lifted Singapore up?
Lee Kuan Yew created a very good public administrative structure. Singapore probably has the best public administration in the world today. It's utterly rational. You feel it when you land in Changi Airport. Things are as simple as they could be. Taxes are low. Some taxes are high, like motor cars, but that's for reasons of traffic control. But generally, it's as rationally organized a country or a city as you can imagine it to be. In most cities or countries, the problem is politics. Politics become a game. And leaders, even though they know what ought to be done, they are preoccupied with winning elections, winning votes, and therefore taking shorter-term measures, even though they know that these shorter-term measures have long-term costs. In a sense, the countries which do better are those which are able to keep their politics relatively simple. But the danger of keeping it too simple is you have an autocracy. It may lead to abuse of power, and then even greater problems. The challenge is always how to maintain a good balance between the two. If you're a big country, you have much more internal buffers, so you can ride the ups and downs. But if you're a small country, you may not have a second chance, as Jerome reminded me before this meeting began. So we can't take liberties with ourselves. City-states only survive if they have strong leadership. And however you decide the structure of power, you must have an authority which can decide and which can act quickly.
When you speak to people in the West about Singaporean economic model, and you tell them, Singapore has no capital gain taxes, no inheritance tax, generally low taxes, they think, it's like a free market paradise. But then you tell them, more than 80% of people live in public housing, more than 80% of the economy is dominated by state-owned companies, all education is public, they think it's a socialized paradise. So what really is Singapore? Some hybrid or...
No, there's nothing new. I mean, you brought me on the tour of Zagreb 2 days ago, and the guide showed us the old city, which was monastic, and the free city. What is a free city? A free city is one which attracts badly treated people and badly treated money. So if you're a free city, they flow to you. So Singapore is like that. There's nothing new. If you think of Singapore like a medieval free city and how those free cities were able to attract talent and capital, Singapore is like that. And free cities survive for as long as they have leaders who are clear-headed and external conditions which are not too threatening. If they're overwhelming, then you cannot survive. But if you can manage the external environment, and the external environment is permissive, and you maintain internal integrity and clarity, then you'll always be able to attract talent, technology, the arts, and money.
Could you comment maybe for us in Europe, where the social state, the welfare state is so dominant and overwhelming, could you comment a little bit on how Singapore approached the problem of the welfare state? Was it discussed? What was the direction you decided to ultimately take when it comes to welfare state?
The ruling party of Singapore, which has been in power since the beginning, describes itself as a democratic socialist party. In public speeches, ministers sound quite right-wing in terms of free market policies. But in social policies, we are in fact very left-wing. And some of my friends from China describe Singapore as being more socialistic than China, which in some ways it is, in terms of education, universal health care, in terms of public housing. Over 80% of the apartments in Singapore are built by the government. They are sold to the people on long-term leases of 99 years, so that the citizens have a sense of ownership. But they are subsidized, built by the government to very high quality, and in a way which many free market economists would be aghast by, that this is somehow in contravention of some sacred principles. We are pragmatic, we are not ideological. We do not begin on the basis of theory. We begin on the basis of balance. In order to be united, you must have solidarity. In order to have solidarity, you must look after the weakest, the elderly, those who are less endowed. But at the same time, you cannot pull down the people who are the most creative. And the people who are the most creative, they cannot disdain the people who live around them. This is what I would describe as the tension between town and gown. In any city, the creative elements belong to a small minority. Like in a university town, they are the professors. But then there are the ordinary town folk who beaver away, who benefit from the gown being there, but who will be very angry if the people who wear gowns look down on them. So there has to be a soft relationship, a relationship based on mutual regard and respect between town and gown. And I think in different ways, this is a tension in all societies, between solidarity and merit, between looking after the weakest and rewarding those who contribute more. How that balance should be tweaked, well, that depends from situation to situation, from historical period to historical period, and this is at the core of all politics.
Okay. Singapore, to many of us, one of the first kind of association that comes when one thinks of Singapore is meritocracy and no corruption. And I guess this is also associated, you said, associated with the fact that Lee Kuan Yew was very determined to make these contributors, the creative part of the society, feel the benefits of their work. And Singapore is also known to be as a country where ministers are the most highly paid ministers in the world. So, for instance, I've checked yesterday, but a Singaporean minister will be receiving a salary of several $7 million, maybe. So, is that how is it all connected? Meritocracy, no corruption, and the high reward for the.
It is a big issue in Singapore, ministers' salaries, and in every elections, many people feel that ministers are paid too much. It's not several $1 million, but it is substantial. It's over $1 million. Mm-hmm. People feel that you're in public service. Why are you paying yourself so much? And they resent it. And it's not difficult for those who are opposed to the government to use that as an issue to inflame public opposition. But at the same time, we have to be realistic. We are a banking center. We have to attract investments. We have to attract traders to come to Singapore. So we have civil servants who are diplomats, who are bank regulators, who are investment promoters. They deal with investors, they deal with bankers, they deal with people who are highly paid. And if they themselves are poorly paid, the good ones will be poached by the other side. Then you have a big problem. Because if your regulators, if your promoters are not as smart, not as capable as those whom they are regulating or promoting, then the state becomes weak. So in order to ensure a fair balance of talent between the public and private sectors, there must be some equalization of rewards. But of course, discounting for the fact that there's probably more job security in the public sector than the private sector. The logic for public administration, I think, is clear and incontrovertible. Then you come to political leaders. Should political leaders be paid on the same basis as public servants? Some people say, no, you should do it as a public service. But if you do that, eventually, those who have families to look after, whose children have got to be financed through university, whose spouses feel that they should not be overly disadvantaged, they'll say, well, in that case, they find reasons not to enter public life. They'll never say that's a reason, but they always find good reasons to tell the prime minister or to a political leader why they should be excluded from consideration. There are indeed many disadvantages of being in public life. You enjoy no privacy, you're on call all the time. And if you have a system where the game is stacked against those whom you really want, then who will be in politics? There will be those who desire power for its own sake, and then people who quietly will convert that power to money. Then you have a lot of other problems. I'm not saying that paying high salaries is a panacea, will solve all problems, but paying very low salaries will inevitably create problems. The water must somehow find its own level. And sometimes you'll find its own level in the most iniquitous ways. We are very, we have a system which more or less works in Singapore. There are problems. We always try to make it better. We know other countries are also struggling. We can't tell others what to do because they have their own specific circumstances. The culture of a people has a strong bearing. In the Scandinavian countries, there's zero tolerance for corruption. In Asian countries, maybe Mediterranean countries, there's a higher tolerance of corruption. And if you do not maintain discipline in the system, then there's a slide down the slippery path. So in Singapore, the system, the discipline of the system is constantly maintained. So we have quite a fierce anti-corruption. In fact, we have two anti-corruption agencies, one for simple corruption, the other for commercial crimes. And we have a system of a directly elected president, a little like yours, and where if there's an investigation against the prime minister, the president can approve it, and vice versa. But no system is perfect. I mean, Venice, Dubrovnik, they had centuries of statecraft. They found clever ways of making sure that power is not concentrated, but still from time to time things slip through. And so politics is inherently an art and an unstructured field.
And Singapore is a heterogeneous society, so you have a majority of Chinese, you have Malaysian Muslims, and you have Indians, and then expats and internationals. How do you keep this society unified? When we discussed this a couple of days ago, you mentioned something that I found interesting. You said Singapore is, in a way, like Yugoslavia, except... could you comment a little bit on that?
I was last in this part of the world in 1989 to attend a meeting of the non-aligned movement. At that time, the rotating president was from Slovenia, and my liaison officer was a Slovene. And that year, Belgrade celebrated the 800th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. Within 2-3 years, the whole thing unraveled. What Tito and before him, what the Austro-Hungarian Empire tried to do was to create a high unity among people who are essentially tribal. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the forces are too great. The higher structure, it disintegrates, and the constituent pieces break loose, sometimes cleanly, sometimes messily. In the case of Croatia, I think by good leadership and by good luck, it broke off cleanly. And today you have a pretty homogeneous population, which, coming from Singapore, I thought is an advantage. Because being heterogeneous means that you have problems every day. Problems of religion, problems of food, problems of expectations, problems of differential performance in school, in offices, everywhere. In Singapore, we have 3/4 Chinese, 15% Muslims, 7% Indian, and then large foreign communities, different habits, different body language, different standards of what constitutes polite behavior. And they meet in schools, they meet in the trains, they meet in the food courts, and there's always conflict. And these conflicts, if you don't attend to them, like a good gardener, if you leave them, they get very big. And then you have a big problems on your hands. So you've got to do gardening every day. And it's tiring to do gardening. Sometimes you wish, oh, why can't you just be like in the natural meadow and the things look after themselves? Won't that be marvelous? But then, it is this diversity within Singapore which connects us to the network which gives us life. So we have links to China, we have links to Indonesia and Malaysia, we have links to Australia, to Japan, to Europe, to India. And we have all these links because within ourselves, we carry those threads. Yes, they lead to tension, we've got to find ways to manage them. But if we wish ourselves to be homogeneous, then our usefulness, our place in the network will disappear. So nothing in life comes for free. If you are comfortable being homogeneous, like the Japanese are homogeneous, it can also be a crippling disadvantage. In Croatia, you're over 90% Croat. I think that's a great advantage. But it's good to have minorities within you. It's good to be sensitive to them. In fact, it's good to be overly sensitive to them because if you are within your country, then when you deal with foreigners, you'll be sensitive to foreigners. And it is that larger network which gives you life. So you want to be too comfortable, you have a big problem. Some discomfort is in fact not a bad thing. And that discomfort requires constant management. And that management in the end defines who we are. That becomes our self-identity. So looking back, was it bad to have attempted Yugoslavia? Was the Austro-Hungarian Empire a good thing or a bad thing? That question has no definitive answer. It's something that constantly must be reflected upon.
What do you think other countries, smaller countries here in Europe, can learn from Singapore? Countries like Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Hungary. What can they, are there any generalizable lessons to be taken?
When I was trade minister, I had the Treaty of Rome on my table because we were engaged in building up an ASEAN Southeast Asian community called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, 10 countries. And the common market made a lot of sense. It was a simple document, the Treaty of Rome. It was readable. It was inspiring. Then, by progressions, it became the EEC, the EC, the EU, and the Acquis Communautaire. Today, it is incomprehensible. When institutions are very complex, and ordinary people don't understand them, and even educated people don't understand them, they will lose the affection of the citizenry. And if institutions lose the affection of the citizenry, they become alien and oppressive. And the reaction is one of rebellion. This is always a problem of over-centralization. The Catholic Church, which from the times of Jesus Christ was cellularized, so that the bishops are not in a hierarchy, the bishops are in a college, evolve a moral principle of subsidiarity, that whatever need not be centralized must not be centralized, because it oppresses the individual, it oppresses a local community. The EU enunciates the principle of subsidiarity, but I think in its practice, it overrides subsidiarity, and I think in some ways it's gone too far. We know in ASEAN that we are very diverse. We don't have the same inheritance as you have in Greece, Rome, and Judeo-Christianity. We are 10 countries in between two big civilizations, of China and of India. And we have been, over the centuries, affected by both. So we have to take a very realistic view of the degree of integration that is realistic, because over-integration leads to brittleness, we'll break up. So we have to be soft, we have to be elastic, we have to have a variable geometry to take the stresses and strains. So as trade minister and later as foreign minister, I said, yes, the first few steps of Europe should also be our stepping stones. But looking further ahead, we have to diverge. We can't have Schengen in Southeast Asia because Singapore is a city-state. We have a per capita income so much greater than that of Laos or Myanmar. And if we have open borders, we'll be swamped. We can't have a common currency because we are too small compared to our neighbors. We have to be realistic. But we do have a common economic space. We are largely zero tariffs to one another. There's lots more harmonization to do. We have almost, except for Myanmar, visa-free access to each other's country. And we are simplifying border clearances. And our internal connectivity and our connectivity to our neighbors improving year by year. So we can't tell Europe what to do because for all the problems of the European construction, it has created upon this continent the longest period of peace that is ever enjoyed. The collapse of the Soviet Union, in normal historical terms, would have led to warfare, revolution all across the periphery. That the collapse of the Soviet Union was like the skillful implosion of an old building on a work site. Is largely due to the European idea. I remember some of my Danish friends telling me how, because they had supported the Baltic republics for decades, they had the moral authority to tell the early leaders, you don't mistreat the Russians in the Baltic states. If you do so, we'll be very angry with you. Without the intervention of Europe and America, the problems in the Balkans could have been 100 times worse and still ongoing today. That it's all happened in a relatively clean way is because of what Europe has achieved. So there's the side of Europe which is not very good, but there's the side of Europe which has done immense good. And it's not for someone from far away to make judgments.
Maybe at this point I'd like to open up for questions if you have any. Over there to the left, young lady.
My name is Martina. I'm a student at Zagreb School of Economics and Management. First of all, thank you for the nice talk about Singapore. So my question is, would you agree with me that English knowledge is one of Singapore's core competencies in the region? Because in Singapore, everyone speaks English, other than other countries in the region. But then again, we have Singlish, which has become a cultural identity, I would say, of all Singaporeans, because, okay, there are 3 different cultures in Singapore, but they're all Singaporeans and their whole cultural identity is Singlish. So do you see Singlish as a problem or as a good thing for Singapore?
Thank you. That's a great question. So language for Singapore. That was also one of the things Lee Kuan Yew had to make a decision on.
It's too early to say whether our language policy has been successful, because these things take a long time to play out. Lee Kuan Yew took us on a forced march and moved the entire population to English as a common language of communication, and moved the Chinese population away from dialects to Mandarin, which is a common language of all Chinese people. The result has been a difficulty of communication between grandparents and grandchildren. And I think much cultural transmission has been affected because of this switch. And because when you have to switch language very quickly, you switch words, but you use old syntax. So the structure of Singlish, which is actually quite complicated, is based upon Southern Chinese dialects and the Malay language, with English words replacing Chinese and Malay words. And that's what Singlish is. It is not something we encourage because it has limited utility, and very often it reflects a lack of higher education. It is not something we disdain, because when I was in Dubrovnik, I saw some Asian faces, I looked at them, then I heard them speak, and I immediately picked up the Singapore accent, and I felt an emotional ping, an emotional connection. So you talked earlier about someone speaking with Dubrovnik accent. Accents are a way by which we establish common tribal origins, because the accents that you pick up are those that you pick up when you are young. When you learn a language as an adult, you still carry the accent in that language. And therefore, while we want to be global, the sense of deep identity, of being local, is very important to our sense of being a human being. If you're a Singaporean and you can't speak Singlish, people say, who are you? Are you really Singaporean? Of course, it'd be good if you can speak good Mandarin and good English, but in certain situations, if you cannot speak Singlish, people will raise eyebrows. And I'm sure it's the same everywhere in the world.
Another question?
Hi, George. I have a question. So your generation basically built the country up, positioned it to where it is now.
I'm not that old.
Nice. Can you tell us now, with the changing of the guard, so to say, with the new generation coming up, although, as you said, you're somewhere still in the middle, they still probably seek your advice. What are the 3 main challenges over the next, let's say, 1.5 to 2 decades for Singapore?
We spend a lot of time thinking through what the rise of China means to us and to our neighbors, economically, strategically, geopolitically. The rise of China will affect, in a profound way, the immediate periphery. China is now talking about One Belt, One Road, and connecting the entire Eurasian landmass over land, by air, and by sea. Part of it will pass through Croatia. But Singapore is almost China's neighbor. China can be a problem to us in terms of economic competition. China can be a huge opportunity. So we spend a lot of time thinking through the strategic environment. By 2050, if we work backwards, by 2050, the world's biggest economy is likely to be China by a significant margin. The world's second biggest economy will either be the US or India. By 2030, India will have a bigger population than China. The world's fourth biggest economy in PPP terms is likely to be Indonesia because of its large population. So if you look at China, India, Indonesia, Singapore is right in the middle. And if we cannot make a living under such conditions, we have only ourselves to blame. Because surely, in the interstices, at the boundaries, we should be able to do things to arbitrage, to be of help. Because our very nature connects us to China, to India, to Southeast Asia. So that's the first thing that we worry a lot about. The second thing that we worry a lot about is who we are internally. If we all speak English and we lose our mother tongues, then we may become deculturalized. Then who are we? But if the Chinese feel that they are very Chinese and the Indians feel they're very Indians, then are we Singaporeans? What does it mean to be Singaporean? Every year we have new citizens. And as a member of parliament, I used to, for new citizens in my constituency, give out certificates. And I always make the same speech in different ways to them. That you are from China, you are from Myanmar, you are from Indonesia, you are from Vietnam. Please do not cut links off to where you come from. These links are precious to us. You are our link to those countries. There's only one requirement to be a Singaporean, which is that when you become a Singapore citizen, your heart should be a bit bigger, your mind should be a bit broader, to accept those who are not like yourself. So if you are Chinese, please understand the Muslim, please understand the Indian. If you're the Indian, please understand the others. So that it is in the higher software, in the hyperlink, that we become Singaporean. This is in abstraction, what it actually means in terms of education policy, in terms of social policy, in terms of preventing enclaves, ghettos, regrowing in Singapore. These practical expressions are complicated, but there must be a clarity of purpose. There is a third concern, which is a growing one, which is that of jihadi terrorism. Half of Southeast Asians are Muslims, mostly in Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, some in Singapore, southern Thailand, southern Philippines. And the global Muslim community has seen the growth of a malignancy. And these cancer cells are in the system. And if you're not careful, they metastasize and they can create a big problem like Boko Haram or ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And we have a local franchise called the JI in Singapore and Southeast Asia. Even though Muslims are only 15% of our population, and even though this problem may be 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, it can create a lot of trouble for us. So a lot of our nervous energies and intellectual energies are invested in addressing this specific problem of a malignancy in the Islamic body politic. If we don't watch it, a small problem can become very big. So it is well worth our time and effort and energy to worry about this and to find ways to prevent this problem from getting worse and to prevent outsiders from increasing that problem for us in Singapore, and also preventing Singapore from exporting these problems to other countries. So we act in cooperation with others. So I would say these are, in broad terms, the 3 challenges. One is the external environment and what it means for us and our positioning. Then internally, how we evolve our sense of identity and as a Singaporean while maintaining diversity. And the third is a specific one, addressing the problem of jihadi terrorism.
Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Hello, I'm Martin. I'm from Czech Republic. And
Sorry.
Thank you for a wonderful speech. I have a question that you posed about public sector. You mentioned that there are really high salaries for representatives of government and the people who are representing the republic. I was wondering if you're not afraid of disorderly conduct concerning the high salaries, that the people who are having a lot of money are actually developing a greed in themselves in terms of willing to have more than they have currently. And how do you think they can prevent that?
I guess this ties also well with the question of inequality in Singapore. And
well, you need systems in place, like systems for whistleblowing, anti-corruption agencies which investigate without fear or favor. And you need effective laws. And you must be able to take into account, punish those who transgress and who betray the public trust. But in the end, you need a population which is itself intolerant to corruption. If as individuals I expect to be bought, whether it's for my vote or for my agreement to certain things, then we cannot be surprised that our leaders can be bought. So it is, in the end, the culture of a people and their own attitudes. If they expect gifts for themselves, then they should not be surprised that corruption is part of the way the system operates. So you need structure, you need systems, and in the end, you need an overall culture of intolerance towards corruption. And money is only a hygiene factor. It doesn't mean that if you're well paid, that you will not be corrupt, because the human greed has no limit.
there was one question over there.
Thank you for your insightful comments and analysis. I have two questions, one internal, one external. I was just referring to you mentioned the sort of extraordinary capability of Singaporean civil servants. So my question is, how is it that Singapore was able to attract, these sort of highly talented, engaged, and loyal people when the opportunity set in the private sector is so high? And the second question is, as a city-state, it's become a model, and we're seeing a lot of discussion about the creation of these megacities. What do you think the nation-state will look like in 25 years?
Your first question, it's become more difficult for the Singapore government to attract its share of talent. When we were poorer, the scholarships which the government offered to the brightest students to go to Oxford, Cambridge, Ivy League universities was so attractive that there was no competition. If the government had not offered me a scholarship, I couldn't have gotten to Cambridge. It was something I didn't even think about. In return, I had to serve 8 years in public service. The period of bond has come down to 6 years. But today, many parents on their own can send their children overseas to the best institutions. And if your parents can give you that scholarship, then I don't want a government scholarship, because then I'm only tied to my parents and not tied to the government. So it's become a challenge for the Singapore government to attract its fair share of talent. But it's something which we've got to adjust to, because if we don't attract our fair share of talent, then public administration in Singapore must degrade. You ask about the nature of the city and the nation state in the coming years. In Davos, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, the networked world, and how we're all interlinked, how we all have options. Nation states have weakened. Certainly the Westphalian state has weakened tremendously. And today, if you overtax your population, you lose your people. You lose the investors. You just go next door. So governments are constrained because governments are now in competition with other governments. Cities are in competition with other cities. To me, the best description was what Arnold Toynbee, the Oxford historian who wrote A Study of History, many years ago. He talked about the ecumenopolis, where in the end, the civilizations are all linking up in the neural network, So whether it is looking at the flow of aeroplanes or electricity or data or how the globe looks at night, it looks more and more like the human brain. So we're all connected, and each node has no guarantee of success. The node exists as a significant node only because it allows things to pass through faster through it. So we're in competition. You cannot opt out, because if you opt out, you just shrivel up and have no meaning in this network world. So small countries, being able to move faster, in fact, enjoy a great advantage in a network world. But I come back to what I said earlier. The precondition for this is there must be peace. If there's no peace, then small countries are in great danger. And therefore, small countries have a profound interest in international agreements and in establishing peaceful federations or confederations.
Any other questions over there?
Thank you. My name is Ilya and I'm a student from Russia. As I am not mistaken, the last European Business Forum was held in order to discuss the issues of globalization. So let me underline this topic because I think it's correlated with what we are discussing now. With all the trends that provides globalizations, I want you to discuss if all these trends act in favor of small countries, such as Croatia or Singapore, or not.
So globalization and the impact on small countries, positive, negative?
There's advantage in size. Size gives you diversification. Size allows you to ride through cycles. Size gives you more room to make mistakes and therefore the ability to take greater risks. Size as expressed in a nation state is no longer the most important. I think size is best measured in tribal terms, in network terms. So if you're Russian, if you're ethnic Russian, if you're ethnic, if you're Croat, if you are a Chinese, that, I'm sorry?
I'm asking about your country, Singapore and Croatia.
He's asking about the small countries, how the...
Yes, so small countries must operate networks. So Croatia is not Croatia. Croatia is not Croatia, Croatians in Croatia. Croatia is Croatians worldwide. And the more you're able to link Croatians worldwide, the more you have an internal network in the larger neural network. For Singapore, for the Port of Singapore, for Singapore Airlines, for any company now, you must operate a network. If you're just operating a point, I think you're weak. So the nation state, if it doesn't acknowledge that, if it doesn't promote that, and it thinks that because it's got boundaries and therefore it's strong, that is not necessarily true. I think the homogeneity of the nation state is also important. Because if you are big, but you are diverse within, that size, in fact, becomes a problem. Because they are endlessly quarreling among yourselves.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time. We could be talking here for another hour or two and we wouldn't be bored. For those of you who want to know more about Singapore, where you're lucky, because we have just recently published the last book of Lee Kuan Yew that he wrote, One Man's View of the World, and if you want, you can buy it outside. It's in Croatian, so this is relevant only for the Croatians in the room. I want to thank George again for being here, for having this wonderful talk, and I'd like to invite you all for a lunch, which will take place in a restaurant of Museum and Craft.